200 years of forging, gone, not in a war, not in a fire, not in some unavoidable act of God. The American axe industry, an industry that carved this country out of raw timber, that built the cabins, cleared the farmland, laid the railroad ties, and put a tool in the hand of every working man from Maine to Oregon, was disassembled piece by piece by a sequence of corporate decisions made in boardrooms where nobody had ever swung an axe. Here are the numbers. By 1900, the United States had well over 100 companies forging axe heads. By 1950, that number was dropping. By 2000, you could count the survivors on one hand. Right now, the vast majority of axes hanging on pegboard hooks in American hardware stores are forged in China. The steel is different. The geometry is different. The heat treatment is different. And the cost to make one is a fraction of what it costs to make a real one in Pennsylvania or West Virginia or Connecticut. This is not a story about free trade. This is not a story about market evolution. This is the case file on how an entire American manufacturing tradition, one that produced the single most important hand tool in the settlement of North America, was hollowed out from the inside before the foreign competition ever showed up. Remember that detail. The damage started at home. The American felling axe was never just a tool. It was an engineering departure from everything Europe had built for centuries. European axes were light, narrow. They lacked a pole, that flat striking surface on the back of the head opposite the bit. An American axe head had that pole. It added weight behind the eye. It gave the tool balance. It turned the axe into a precision instrument that could bring down a 2-foot diameter white oak in minutes if the man swinging it knew what he was doing. And the men knew what they were doing. By the 1820s and 1830s, axe manufacturing was becoming one of the first real American industries. Samuel W. Collins founded Collins and Company in 1826 in what would become Collinsville, Connecticut, a town that literally took its name from the factory. Collins didn't just make axes. He systematized axe production. He built trip hammers powered by the Farmington River. He standardized head weights. He controlled the steel supply. Within decades, Collins axes were being exported worldwide. Central America, South America, Australia. The American axe pattern with its heavy pole, its curved bit, its optimized geometry became the global default. Not because of marketing, because it worked better than anything else on the planet. And Collins was not alone, not even close. Plumb. Fayette R. Plumb and Company, founded in 1856, Philadelphia. Mann Edge Tool Company, Lewistown, Pennsylvania. Warren Axe and Tool Company, Warren, Pennsylvania. Kelly Axe Manufacturing Company, Charleston, West Virginia, founded in 1904, eventually one of the largest axe plants on earth. These were not small shops. These were industrial operations running drop forges, employing hundreds of workers, producing thousands of axe heads per day. The process itself mattered. A properly forged American axe head started as a billet of medium carbon steel, typically in the 1045 to 1060 range. That billet was heated to forging temperature, roughly 1,800 to 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit depending on the operation. It was placed under a drop hammer or a power hammer and shaped in a series of dies. The eye was punched, not drilled. On the best axes, the bit, the cutting edge, was a separate piece of higher carbon steel, forge-welded onto the body of the head to give it a harder edge while keeping the body tough enough to absorb impact without cracking. That is not a simple manufacturing process. That is metallurgical knowledge passed between generations of forge workers who understood what the steel looked like at the right temperature, what it sounded like under the hammer when the grain structure was correct, what it felt like when the weld between body and bit had taken properly. You cannot write that knowledge into a manual. It lived in the hands of the people on the floor. Every region in America developed its own axe pattern. The Dayton pattern, the Jersey pattern, the Michigan pattern, the Connecticut pattern, the Rockaway. The reversible, dozens of distinct head shapes, each one evolved over decades of use in specific timber, specific terrain, specific working conditions. A logger in the Pacific Northwest did not swing the same axe as a farmer clearing hardwood in upstate New York. The shapes were different because the jobs were different. That granularity is the signature of a living craft tradition. People who collect vintage American axes know the differences by sight. Hold a pre-war Kelly head next to a Collins head next to a Plumb head, and the profiles are distinct. The cheek geometry, the bit sweep, the pole dimensions, these were not interchangeable commodities. They were regional engineering solutions refined by workers who used them and forge crews who listened to the men who used them. Ask a collector which brand was best. You will not get a single answer. You will get an argument that has been running for 100 years and shows no sign of stopping. The first blow did not come from overseas. It came from a forest in the Pacific Northwest, and it had a pull cord. The chainsaw changed everything. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, portable gasoline-powered chainsaws were replacing the felling axe and the crosscut saw in commercial logging. The axe did not disappear overnight. It remained essential for limbing, for splitting, for 100 tasks around a worksite and a homestead. But its role as the primary tool for dropping timber, the role it had held for centuries, was over. Demand for felling axes collapsed. Not slowly. Within roughly a decade, the market for professional-grade felling axes shrank to a fraction of its former size. The axes that still sold were lighter-duty models, camp axes, kindling axes, utility axes for occasional use. The customers were no longer professional loggers who destroyed 3 or 4 heads a year and demanded perfect steel. The customers were homeowners who bought one axe and used it twice a season. This shift changed the economics. When your customer base shifts from professionals who need quality to consumers who compare prices, the math changes. The pressure on cost per unit intensifies. And that pressure did exactly what it always does to American manufacturing. The consolidations began. Kelly Axe and Tool was acquired by True Temper, itself originally the American Fork and Hoe Company, a conglomerate that had been swallowing tool brands for decades. Plumb ended up under corporate ownership. Collins and Company, the oldest name in American axe manufacturing, eventually ceased domestic production. The exact year is debated, but by the 1960s or early 1970s, depending on who you ask, the forges in Collinsville were no longer making axe heads. True Temper became the gravitational center of American axe production, and then True Temper itself became a financial instrument. This is where the prosecution's case turns. This is where the evidence shifts from market forces to specific decisions made by specific people for specific reasons that had nothing to do with making a good axe. True Temper was sold, then sold again. It passed through the hands of private equity firms who saw it as a portfolio asset, not a manufacturing company. The details of every transaction are not fully public, but the pattern is clear and repeated across dozens of American tool companies in the same period. A private equity group buys a legacy manufacturer. They cut costs. They move production. They extract value. They sell the shell to the next group. At no point in this process does anyone on the decision-making level care whether the axe is any good. They care whether the margins are improving quarter over quarter. I read through old product catalogs and investor communications from this era. The language tells you everything. The word heritage appears. The word brand value appears. The word forge does not. If you walk into a Home Depot or a Lowe's right now and pick up an axe, a name brand axe, possibly even one with an American brand name stamped on the head, turn it over. Read the fine print. Most of what you will find on that shelf was forged in China. The steel is different. Production-grade Chinese axe heads are frequently cast or forged from a lower grade of carbon steel with less precise heat treatment. The edge geometry is often set by machine with minimal hand finishing. The eye dimensions are standardized for the cheapest possible handle fit. The pole is there, but it is not always the calibrated counterweight that the original American design intended. Does it chop wood? Yes. You can split kindling with a $10 axe from a discount bin. Nobody disputes that. But the difference between that axe and a properly forged American axe is the difference between a tool designed to perform at the limit of the material and a tool designed to pass a minimum threshold at the lowest, and the people who knew how to hit that precise in-between, the forge workers, the heat treaters, the grinders, they are gone. Not retired. Gone. The knowledge left with them. You cannot Google the specific way a forge worker at the Kelly plant judged the color of steel at welding temperature. That knowledge was transmitted hand to hand, shift to shift, year to year, and when the forges shut down, it stopped transmitting. If that math bothers you, if the idea that 2 centuries of accumulated metallurgical craft knowledge was liquidated to save a few dollars per unit on a tool most buyers use twice a year, then you understand why this channel exists. Hit like on this one. It tells us to keep building these cases. The import numbers tell the final chapter of this story. Exact market share figures fluctuate year to year, but the trend is not ambiguous. By the early 2000s, Chinese manufactured axes and hatchets dominated the American retail market by volume. The price point was simply unbeatable. A forged-in-America axe head, made by a worker earning an American wage, using American-sourced steel, in a facility meeting American environmental and safety regulations, could not be produced for the same cost as a head coming out of a factory in Guangdong province. Not even close. This is not a complaint about Chinese manufacturing capability. Chinese forges are capable of producing excellent steel products when the spec demands it and the buyer is willing to pay. The problem is that the American retail buyer, trained by decades of cost-cutting to expect a $25 axe, will not pay $80 for a domestic head on a hickory handle. The market was conditioned to accept the cheaper product, and once that conditioning took hold, there was no reversing it at scale. Some survived. Not many. Council Tool Company in Lake Waccamaw, North Carolina has been forging tools since 1886. They still make axes in America. Their Velvet line, a revival of an old premium brand, is forged and finished domestically. The steel is good. The geometry is correct. The price reflects what it actually costs to make a real axe in a real American forge with real American labor. There are a handful of small batch makers, independent smiths, boutique operations selling hand-forged heads for prices that would have made a 1940s logger's eyes water. The craft survives in pockets, but pockets are not an industry. The towns tell the rest. Collinsville, Connecticut still exists. The old Collins Company factory complex still stands. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is not making axes. It has been converted to other uses. The river still runs past it. The trip hammers are silent. The town survived because it is close enough to Hartford to absorb commuters. Not every factory town was that lucky. Warren, Pennsylvania, Lewistown, Pennsylvania, Charleston, West Virginia. Every one of these places had a forge operation that employed hundreds of people in jobs that paid well, required genuine skill, and produced something that the rest of the country needed. Those jobs are gone. The skills that filled those jobs are gone. The supply chains that fed those forges, the steel mills, the hickory handle producers, the leather sheath makers, contracted or collapsed in sequence. 14-year-old kids in those towns in 1950 could walk out of high school and into a forge job that would support a family for 40 years. Their grandchildren have no equivalent option. That is not nostalgia. That is an economic fact. There is a man, I will not pretend to know his name, but collectors know the type, who has a wall of American axe heads in his garage. 50, 60 heads. Collins, Plumb, Kelly, Mann, Warren. each one stamped with a maker's mark, a pattern name, a city of origin, each one forged by a specific person in a specific building that no longer runs. He can pick up any one of them, sight down the bit, and tell you whether the grind is factory original or resharpened. He knows these tools the way a librarian knows books, by feel, by weight, by the story each one carries. His granddaughter has never seen a drop forge run. She has never heard the sound a power hammer makes when it shapes hot steel. She never will, not in this country, not at scale. The American axe was not killed by a better product. It was killed by a cheaper one, after the companies that made the originals were stripped for parts by owners who never set foot on a forge floor. The competition from Asia was real, but it only finished what the consolidations and the private equity rotation started. By the time Chinese axes flooded the retail market, the domestic industry was already on life support, bled out by decades of mergers, cost cuts, and the systematic decision to treat a 200-year-old manufacturing tradition as a line item to be optimized. Every piece of evidence in this case points to the same verdict. The American axe industry was not outcompeted. It was abandoned. We don't do clickbait on this channel. We build cases. If that is what you come here for, if you want to understand how American industries actually died, with names and dates and evidence instead of slogans, subscribe. There is more of this coming. Council Tool is still running in Lake Waccamaw. A handful of independent smiths are still forging heads by hand. The collectors are still cataloging what remains, arguing over pattern names, trading heads at tool meets, keeping the record alive the only way anyone can, by refusing to let it go quiet. But the forges in Collinsville are cold. The trip hammers do not run. The river still turns, but it powers nothing. 200 years of forging knowledge, built by hand, passed by hand, and ended not by a single blow, but by 1,000 small decisions, made by